"She's in coma, but her lips still whisper your name," said the doctor. The Mafia boss stood frozen. "Before we begin, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And once the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Oh, and make sure to follow our channel for more stories like this." Now, sit back and enjoy every detail. Luca Raldi wasn't a man who believed in fate. He believed in control, in precision, in the careful orchestration of power that had kept him alive and untouchable for 2 decades in the bloodiest city in America. Chicago had taught him early that sentimentality was a luxury reserved for those who didn't mind dying young. His father had been sentimental once, had trusted the wrong associate, had shown mercy when calculation was required, and Luca had watched him bleed out on the kitchen floor when he was 16 years old. That night had carved something permanent into his soul, a coldness that served him well in the years that followed as he rebuilt his family's empire from ash and betrayal. By the time he reached 30, Luca Rinaldi was a name whispered with equal parts reverence and terror. He didn't run street corners or dabble in petty theft. His operations were sophisticated, layered behind legitimate businesses. Construction companies, import-export firms. A chain of upscale restaurants that served as both money-laundering fronts and actual culinary destinations. He understood that true power wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It was about being the voice that didn't need to be raised. His suits were custom-tailored. His movements measured, his anger, a thing so rare and so devastating that most men would do anything to avoid triggering it. He had lovers but no love, associates but no friends, respect but no warmth. It was exactly the life he designed, sterile and secure until the day Clara Bennett walked into his favorite restaurant with a recording device hidden in her purse and questions that no one else dared to ask. She was investigating a series of zoning decisions that had mysteriously favored certain construction projects over others. Following a trail of political donations and backroom deals that led uncomfortably close to Luca's network of influence. Most journalists who got that close either accepted a generous payment to redirect their attention or found their sources suddenly unwilling to talk, their evidence inexplicably lost. Clara was different. She showed up to interview the restaurant manager, asking pointed questions about property acquisitions and permit expeditions. And when Luca's security team identified her as a potential problem, he decided to handle it personally. He expected to intimidate her with a carefully calibrated conversation over dinner to assess whether she could be bought, threatened, or simply convinced that pursuing this story would be hazardous to her career and health. What he didn't expect was the woman herself. Clara Bennett was 26 years old with honey blonde hair that fell in natural waves past her shoulders and eyes the color of amber catching sunlight. She was beautiful in a way that seemed almost defiant, as if her appearance was something she'd learned to weaponize in rooms full of men who underestimated her. But it was her voice that caught him off guard. Steady, intelligent, laced with a humor that suggested she knew exactly how dangerous this meeting was and had decided the story was worth the risk anyway. She accepted his dinner invitation without hesitation. Showed up in a simple black dress that somehow made every other woman in the restaurant look overdressed. And spent 2 hours asking him questions that demonstrated she'd done more research than any journalist he'd ever encountered. Luca found himself genuinely engaged for the first time in years, drawn into a verbal chess match with someone who didn't back down from his carefully constructed intimidation. She knew she was sitting across from a man who could end her investigation with a phone call, who could make her life very difficult if he chose to. But she held her ground with a combination of courage and intelligence that he found intoxicating. When he finally suggested with deliberate ambiguity that continuing her investigation might not be in her best interest, she smiled and said, "Mr. Raldi, if I only wrote stories that were in my best interest, I'd be covering restaurant openings and charity galas. I became a journalist to uncover truth, not to play it safe." It was that moment, that unflinching declaration of purpose that made him realize she was going to be a problem. Not the kind of problem that could be eliminated with money or threats, but the kind that got under your skin and stayed there. Over the following weeks, Clara continued her investigation, and Luca found himself doing something he'd never done before. He started following her progress with genuine interest rather than strategic concern. He had his people monitor her movements, not to intimidate, but to ensure her safety. Because the world she was poking into had darker corners than even she realized. When she started receiving threatening phone calls from people who weren't connected to his organization, he made quiet arrangements to have the harassment stopped. When her apartment was broken into, a crude intimidation tactic by a rival group who saw her investigation as an opportunity to destabilize his operations. He had his security team install new locks and a state-of-the-art alarm system while she was out conducting interviews. She never knew it was him. Their second meeting happened by apparent coincidence at a coffee shop in Lincoln Park. Though Luca had carefully arranged to be there at the same time, she regularly stopped for her morning espresso. This time the conversation was different. She was tired, frustrated by dead ends and sources who'd suddenly gone silent. And instead of pressing him for information, she simply talked about her childhood in Iowa. About the teacher who'd inspired her to pursue journalism. About the idealistic belief that bringing truth to light actually mattered. Luca listened, saying little, watching the animation in her face as she spoke about things that had nothing to do with corruption or power or the brutal machinery of his world. For 90 minutes, he wasn't a mafia boss. He was just a man sitting across from a woman who made him remember that there were people in the world who still believed in something beyond survival and dominance. When her investigation finally fizzled, not because of anything he did, but because the political figures involved had lawyers who knew how to bury evidence in procedural quicksand, Clara published what she could, a detailed expose that named no names, but laid out the structural corruption with enough precision that anyone paying attention understood the implications. The article won her a regional journalism award and cost her her job at the newspaper, which received pressure from advertisers with connections to the politicians Clara had investigated. Luca read the article 3 times, impressed by how much she'd managed to uncover and how carefully she'd written it to avoid legal blowback while still telling the essential truth. He also noted with something uncomfortably close to admiration that she'd omitted certain details that would have led directly to his organization, choosing to focus on the political side of the equation. It was an act of discretion that cost her the strongest part of her story, and he wondered if she'd done it deliberately, protecting him, even as she pursued the truth. Their affair began 2 months later after Clara accepted a freelance position that gave her more independence, and after Luca convinced himself that what he felt for her was simple attraction that could be satisfied and dismissed. He was wrong. What started as an intense physical connection quickly evolved into something deeper and far more dangerous to the carefully controlled life he'd built. Clara challenged him constantly, not about his business directly. Because they had an unspoken agreement not to discuss the specifics of his work, but about his worldview, his assumptions, his practiced cynicism. She made him laugh, something his associates would have found impossible to believe. She argued with him about books and politics and whether people were fundamentally good or fundamentally selfish. And she did it with a passion that made even their disagreements feel like a form of intimacy he'd never experienced before. For 6 months, they existed in a bubble of stolen time. Late dinners at her apartment, weekends at a cabin in Wisconsin that belonged to one of his legitimate businesses. Quiet mornings when he'd wake up to find her already awake, reading with the early light catching in her hair. She never asked him to leave his world, and he never pretended he could. They both understood that what they had was temporary. A beautiful interruption in lives that were heading in fundamentally different directions. But understanding something intellectually and accepting it emotionally are 2 entirely different things. And when Clara discovered she was pregnant, the illusion that they could somehow maintain their separate worlds while sharing their private one shattered completely. She told him on a Thursday evening in October, sitting on the couch in her small apartment with autumn rain streaming down the windows. Luca's first instinct was to problem solve, to calculate how this could be managed, how he could protect her and the child, how they could make this work despite the impossibility of their situation. But Clara had already done her own calculations and reached a different conclusion. I can't raise a child in your world, she said quietly, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. I can't live wondering if every car that parks on our street is surveillance or threat. I can't teach a child that love means living behind security and learning to lie about who their father is. I just can't do it, Luca. He wanted to argue, to promise he could make it safe, but he knew she was right. His world devoured innocence. It twisted love into leverage and family into liability. Bringing a child into it would be selfish, no matter how much he might want to. The conversation that followed was one of the most painful of Luca's life, made worse by the fact that it was conducted with the same careful honesty that had characterized their entire relationship. Clara wasn't angry or accusatory. She simply laid out her decision with heartbreaking clarity. She would leave Chicago, have the baby somewhere far from his world, and raise their child free from the shadow of his name and business. She didn't want money, didn't want his protection, didn't want anything except his agreement to stay away. Our child deserves to grow up normal, she said. Tears finally spilling over despite her efforts to remain composed. To go to school without bodyguards, to make friends without background checks. To believe the world is fundamentally safe. I know you can't give that life. And I'm not blaming you for it, but I can. And I have to. Luca sat in silence for a long time. His mind cataloging all the reasons why letting her disappear was unacceptable, dangerous, impossible. He could find her anywhere she went. He had resources that would make hiding from him nearly impossible. He could ensure they were protected even at a distance, could set up trusts and safety nets without her knowledge. But even as he thought these things, he recognized them for what they were. The instincts of a man accustomed to controlling everything around him, trying to control something that should never be controlled. If he forced his presence into this child's life against Clara's wishes, he would be proving exactly what she feared. That his world consumed everything it touched, that he valued possession over well-being. That he was incapable of the kind of selfless love that parenthood required. So, he did the hardest thing he'd ever done in a life filled with impossible choices. He agreed. He let Clara walk out of his life carrying his child, respecting her decision, even as it tore something fundamental apart inside him. The only thing he asked for was a single letter, a few words to acknowledge that she'd arrived safely and that the baby was born healthy. Clara nodded, understanding that this small concession was the maximum distance he could tolerate, and promised she would send word. They spent one last night together, memorizing each other in the darkness, knowing that when morning came, they would become strangers again. Or at least people pretending to be strangers, which was somehow worse. True to her word, Clara disappeared completely. Luca's people could have found her, but he specifically ordered them not to look. It took every ounce of discipline he possessed to maintain that boundary, especially during the months when he knew she must be showing. Then the weeks when he knew the baby must be due. He threw himself into his work with an intensity that worried even his most hardened associates. Expanding operations, consolidating power, building an empire that filled every empty hour so he didn't have to think about what he'd lost. His reputation grew darker during this period. He was less forgiving of mistakes, quicker to cut ties with unreliable partners, more willing to make examples of people who crossed him. Those who knew him well enough to notice said he'd lost something essential, some small spark of humanity that had kept him from becoming a monster. They weren't entirely wrong. 8 months after Clara left, a letter arrived at his private office, postmarked from a city he wouldn't allow himself to investigate. Inside was a single piece of paper with Clara's handwriting. Words that would haunt him for years to come. Our son was born healthy. He has your eyes and my stubbornness. His name is Marco, which means warlike in Latin. But I hope he grows up never knowing war. Thank you for loving us enough to let us go. Our son will grow up free. Attached to the letter was a single photograph, a newborn with dark hair and those unmistakable rowdy eyes. Wrapped in a blue blanket, already looking at the camera with an intensity that seemed impossible in someone so small. Luca kept that photograph in his wallet, the only personal item he carried, the only piece of evidence that he'd once been capable of putting someone else's needs before his own desires. The years that followed were the most professionally successful of Luca's life and the most personally hollow. He turned 40, then 45, watching his empire expand while his personal world contracted to late nights in his office. Rare visits to his mother, who asked increasingly pointed questions about when he'd settle down, and a rotation of lovers who never stayed longer than a few months because he never let them close enough to matter. He told himself he'd made the right choice, that Clara and Marco were better off without him, that his sacrifice had given them the life they deserved. But late at night, alone in the penthouse overlooking the city he controlled, he wondered if he'd simply been a coward. Too afraid of failing them to even try. Too convinced of his own corruption to believe he could be anything else. He learned to compartmentalize the loss, to pack it away in some mental drawer that he only opened in private moments of weakness. His associates knew not to ask about his personal life. His mother eventually stopped suggesting he should marry and give her grandchildren. Sensing something broken beneath his polite deflections, he became the man everyone expected him to be. Cold, calculating, completely dedicated to maintaining and expanding his power. It was a life of absolute control and absolute emptiness. Exactly what he'd chosen when he let Clara walk away. He told himself it was enough. Most days he almost believed it. Then 13 years after that last night in Clara's apartment, she walked back into his life under circumstances he could never have anticipated. It started with a phone call from one of his restaurant managers mentioning that a woman had been asking questions about how to reach him. Not threatening questions, not investigative journalism, just simple, polite inquiries about whether Mr. Rinaldi still owned the establishment and if there might be a way to send him a message. The description the manager gave made Luca's heart stop. Blonde hair streaked with early gray amber eyes, a voice that was both familiar and changed. He'd given strict instructions years ago that if anyone matching Clara's description ever appeared, he was to be notified immediately, though he'd never actually believed it would happen. He arranged to meet her at the same restaurant where they'd first sat across from each other more than a decade before, choosing a private room where they wouldn't be interrupted or observed. Luca arrived early, something he never did, and found himself uncharacteristically nervous. Adjusting his tie, checking his reflection. Feeling like a teenager preparing for a first date rather than a man who'd ordered executions without blinking. When Clara finally walked in, he understood immediately that something was fundamentally different. She was still beautiful, would always be beautiful to him. But there was a fragility he'd never seen before, a transparency to her skin, and a careful way she moved that spoke of pain being constantly managed. They sat down across from each other, and for a long moment, neither spoke. Then Clara smiled, that same devastating smile he remembered, and said, "Hello, Luca. I know you're wondering why I'm here, and I promise I'll explain everything. But first, I need to tell you that our son is extraordinary. Marco is smart and kind and everything I hoped he'd be. He's 13 now, starting to ask questions about his father. And I thought," she paused, her voice catching slightly. "I thought he deserved to know you before it's too late." The phrase "too late" hung in the air between them like a physical presence, and Luca felt something cold settle in his chest. "Clara, what's wrong?" His voice came out rougher than intended, stripped of the careful control he usually maintained. She met his eyes and he saw the truth there before she said the words. "I'm sick, Luca. It's called amyloidosis, a rare disease where abnormal proteins build up in my organs. The doctors found it 2 years ago, but by then it was already advanced. They've tried various treatments, but the prognosis isn't good. I have maybe 18 months, possibly less. I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty or to ask for anything. I'm telling you because Marco deserves to have a father and you deserve to know your son." The world seemed to tilt on its axis, and Luca experienced something he hadn't felt in over 2 decades. Complete helplessness. He was a man who could make problems disappear with a phone call, who commanded resources that most people couldn't comprehend, who had built an empire on his ability to control and influence outcomes. But sitting across from Clara, watching her calmly describe her own death sentence, he realized that all his power meant absolutely nothing. He couldn't threaten this disease, couldn't negotiate with it, couldn't make it disappear, no matter how many doctors he flew in, or how much money he threw at the problem. For the first time since his father's death, Luca Raldi was facing something he couldn't fix, couldn't control, couldn't dominate into submission. His first instinct was denial. To demand she see his doctors, to insist there must be other treatments, experimental protocols, something that could be done. Clara listened patiently as he laid out possibilities with an urgency that bordered on desperation, then gently interrupted. I've seen 17 specialists across 4 states. I've tried 3 different treatment protocols. I've done everything that medical science currently offers for this condition. I'm not giving up, but I'm also not deluding myself about what's coming. I've known for 2 years, Luca. I've had time to accept it. Now, I need to use the time I have left to give Marco what I couldn't give him before. A connection to his father, a sense of where he comes from, an understanding of both sides of his heritage. The conversation that followed stretched across hours as Clara explained the life she'd built in Portland. A modest house in a good school district, a job teaching at a community college, a network of friends who'd supported her through diagnosis and treatment. She described Marco with obvious pride, a quiet, observant boy who loved mathematics and played chess competitively, who'd inherited Luca's intensity and her idealism in equal measure. She'd told him that his father was someone she'd loved deeply but couldn't be with due to circumstances beyond their control. And Marco had accepted that explanation until recently, when adolescence brought more complex questions about identity and belonging. He needs to know you, Clara said simply. Not the public version, not the criminal everyone whispers about, but the man I fell in love with. The one who exists beneath all the armor and calculation. Luca agreed without hesitation, though he had no idea how to be a father to a 13-year-old stranger or how to navigate the impossible task Clara was proposing. Maintaining his life while simultaneously introducing his son to it in some sanitized version that wouldn't terrify the boy or destroy the relatively normal childhood Clara had fought so hard to provide. They worked out an arrangement where Marco would visit Chicago during school breaks, spending time with Luca in contexts that were carefully curated to hide the darker aspects of his world. Clara would stay in the penthouse Luca maintained downtown, a space he rarely used himself, preferring his more secure residence in the suburbs. And they would figure out how to co-parent a dying woman's son and a stranger's child across a chasm of secrets and lost time. The first meeting between Luca and Marco happened 3 weeks later in the neutral territory of a museum exhibit on Renaissance art, something Clara mentioned Marco had recently become interested in. Luca arrived to find a thin, serious-faced boy who was somehow both utterly unfamiliar and shockingly recognizable. Like looking at a photograph of himself at that age. But with Clara's softer features and more open expression. Marco shook his hand with careful formality, clearly nervous but determined not to show it, and Luca recognized that particular brand of stubborn pride as something distinctly Rinaldi. They walked through the exhibit making stilted conversation about Caravaggio and Michelangelo. Both trying too hard and both aware of it, with Clara trailing a few steps behind. Giving them space while remaining close enough to intervene if things went badly. It was awkward and uncomfortable and nothing like the instant connection that movies and television suggested should happen when fathers and sons met for the first time. Marco was guarded, asking polite questions that revealed nothing about what he was really thinking or feeling. Luca found himself more nervous than he'd been during his first meeting with the commission. Desperate not to say the wrong thing, not to disappoint this boy who'd grown up hearing some version of his story. By the end of that first afternoon, they'd managed maybe 30 minutes of genuine conversation, mostly about chess strategies, which Luca had learned from his own father and could discuss with actual enthusiasm. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. Over the following months, they built something that resembled a relationship through careful accumulation of small moments. Marco visited every few weeks, initially for day trips, then for weekend visits as he became more comfortable. Luca learned his son's routines and preferences, that he was vegetarian, that he loved old science fiction novels, that he had Clara's gift for seeing through and calling it out with devastating politeness. Marco learned about his father through observation more than explanation. That he was unfailingly punctual, that he treated service staff with courtesy, even as he commanded immediate respect from everyone around him. That beneath the controlled exterior was someone who felt things deeply, but had learned to hide it as a survival mechanism. Clara remained the bridge between them, translating each to the other, smoothing over moments of mutual incomprehension, helping them find common ground. But she was also visibly declining. Her energy flagging earlier each visit, her pain medication increasing, her body slowly betraying her despite her determination to remain present and engaged. Luca watched her fade with a helpless rage that he kept carefully hidden from Marco, who was already dealing with the impossible grief of watching his mother die. In private moments when Marco was asleep in the guest room and Clara sat up late because the pain made lying down uncomfortable, Luca would keep her company, bringing tea and blankets and sitting in silence because words felt inadequate to the enormity of what was happening. It was during one of these late-night vigils that Clara made her unexpected proposal. They were sitting in his penthouse living room, the city glowing below them, and she turned to him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Part resignation, part mischief, part something that looked almost like hope. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, "about how I want to spend the time I have left. I don't want to waste it being comfortable and safe in Portland. I don't want my last memories to be of doctor's appointments and well-meaning friends tiptoeing around the obvious. I want to feel alive, Luca. And the truth is, I felt most alive when I was with you." Luca stared at her, not quite understanding what she was suggesting. Clara continued, her voice steady despite the radical nature of what she was proposing. "I want to move to Chicago. I want Marco to have more time with you. To really know you before I'm gone. And I want," she paused, then pushed forward with characteristic courage. "I want to be part of your life again, not hidden away, not kept at a safe distance. I want to see your world, meet your people, understand what you built after I left. I know it sounds crazy. I know all the reasons why it's a terrible idea, but I'm dying, Luca. And that gives me a certain freedom to make terrible ideas and call them last wishes." The proposal was insane, dangerous, potentially catastrophic for the careful separation he'd maintained between his personal feelings and professional life. Bringing Clara fully into his world meant exposing her to risks he'd spent 13 years trying to protect her from. It meant acknowledging her presence to associates who would see her as either a weakness to be exploited or a liability to be eliminated. It meant shattering the carefully constructed walls between the different compartments of his life. Every rational part of his mind screamed that this was a mistake, that he should convince her to return to Portland where she'd be safe and comfortable for whatever time remained. But looking at Clara, this woman who'd never stopped challenging him, who'd walked away from him once to give their son a better life and was now walking back into his world to give them all something else. Something harder to define, but possibly more important. Luca found himself unable to say no. Maybe it was because he'd spent 13 years living with the consequences of choosing safety over connection. Maybe it was because he recognized in her request the same thing he felt every time he looked at Marco and saw all the years they'd lost. Or maybe it was simply that loving someone meant honoring their choices, even when those choices terrified you. "If this is what you want," he said finally, his voice rough with emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in over a decade, "then we'll make it work. But you need to understand what you're agreeing to. My world is dangerous, Clara. It's not the sanitized version I've been showing Marco. There are people who would use you to hurt me. And there are things I do that you won't be able to look away from anymore." Clara moved to Chicago 2 weeks later with a decisiveness that reminded Luca why he'd fallen in love with her in the first place. She wasn't running from her diagnosis. She was running toward whatever time she had left, determined to live it fully rather than spend it dying gradually in comfortable obscurity. Marco transferred to a private school in the city. One of the few concessions Luca insisted on. A place with excellent security that wouldn't ask too many questions about his father's business or the occasional armed driver who dropped him off. Clara took up residence in the penthouse, transforming it from a sterile showplace into something that actually felt like a home. filling it with books and plants and the kind of warm chaos that Luca's spaces had always lacked. The transition was anything but smooth. Luca's associates reacted with predictable suspicion to the sudden appearance of a woman in his life, particularly one who came with a teenage son and no apparent background in their world. Questions circulated about who she was, how much she knew, whether she represented a security risk or an emotional weakness that could be exploited. Luca shut down the more dangerous speculation with explicit warnings, making it clear that Clara and Marco were under his protection and that any threat to them would be treated as a personal attack on him. It was a statement that raised eyebrows throughout the organization. Luca Raldi didn't make emotional declarations, didn't expose vulnerabilities, didn't tie his personal life to his professional authority in ways that could be weaponized. But something had shifted in Luca during those months of watching Clara decline and getting to know his son. The carefully maintained separation between the man who loved and the man who commanded had started to dissolve, forced by circumstances that wouldn't respect artificial boundaries. He found himself making choices he never would have considered before Clara's return. Pulling back from particularly violent operations, rejecting business opportunities that would have required the kind of brutality he no longer wanted Marco to discover, even starting to explore legitimate expansion of his business empire. His underbosses noticed the change and worried about what it meant for the organization, but none dared to challenge him directly. Luca Rinaldi was still the most dangerous man in Chicago, even if he was currently distracted by domestic concerns. Clara, meanwhile, did something Luca found both fascinating and terrifying. She simply refused to pretend she didn't see what his world actually was. Unlike the previous women who'd orbited his life, either deliberately naive about his business or attracted specifically to the danger of it, Clara looked at everything with clear eyes and journalist's instinct for truth. She met his associates at carefully staged dinners and saw through every performance of legitimacy they offered. She recognized the security protocols and understood what threats they were designed to counter. She observed the respect that bordered on fear in how people spoke to him and knew exactly what that meant about the violence he was capable of commanding. And instead of recoiling or demanding he change, Clara did something unexpected. She started advising him. It began almost accidentally during a conversation about a waterfront development project that was stalled by neighborhood opposition. Luca was planning to use traditional methods: pressure on the aldermen, strategic intimidation of the opposition leaders, making the resistance too costly to maintain. Clara listened to his strategy and then quietly suggested an alternative. What if he actually addressed the community's concerns, built affordable housing into the development, created jobs for local residents, made himself the solution instead of the problem? It was naive, idealistic, exactly the kind of thinking that had no place in his world. But out of some combination of respect for her and curiosity about whether it could possibly work, Luca tried it and watched in amazement as opposition melted into cautious support. When people realized they were being offered partnership instead of conquest, it became a pattern. Clara would sit in on meetings, carefully curated ones that wouldn't expose her to the most violent aspects of his operations, and afterwards offer observations that came from a completely different worldview than the one Luca and his associates operated from. She pushed him to think about long-term reputation instead of short-term dominance. To consider how being known as someone who kept his word and treated people fairly might actually be more valuable than being known as someone too dangerous to cross. She suggested legitimate business opportunities that could be pursued alongside the criminal ones, gradually shifting the organization's center of gravity toward operations that wouldn't require Marco to lie about what his father did for a living. Luca's associates were initially skeptical, then increasingly intrigued as they watched Clara's influence transform their boss from a man who ruled through fear into someone who commanded respect through a more complex mixture of strength and integrity. She taught Luca and through him the entire organization that power didn't have to mean destruction, that building something lasting required different skills than tearing things down. Under her guidance, Luca started making substantial charitable donations under his own name rather than through anonymous channels. Started showing up at community events. Started being known as someone who invested in the city rather than preyed on it. It was a dramatic reimagining of what a man in his position could be. And it only worked because Luca's reputation for ruthlessness remained intact as a foundation beneath the newer, softer image. But even as Clara helped transform his public life, she was becoming increasingly private about her own condition. She hid how much pain she was in, how exhausted she felt, how many pills she took just to make it through a day. She attended events and dinners even when Luca could see the effort it cost her. Determined to be present for Marco and to help Luca build this new version of himself before she ran out of time, Luca learned to read the signs. The way she'd lean slightly against door frames when she thought no one was watching. The careful way she'd lower herself into chairs. The increasing frequency of afternoon naps that she dismissed as simple tiredness, but which clearly indicated her body was failing. Marco, caught between adolescence and the awful knowledge that his mother was dying, responded by throwing himself into spending time with both his parents. He started asking more direct questions about his father's work. No longer satisfied with vague explanations about business and investments, Luca and Clara made the difficult decision to tell him an edited version of the truth. That his father's business operated in gray areas between legal and illegal. That some of what he did was morally complicated. That he built power through methods that couldn't always be justified. But that he was working to transform into something better. It was a lot for a 13-year-old to process, but Marco handled it with maturity that made both his parents proud, acknowledging the complexity without either condemning or idealizing his father. During this period, something remarkable happened. The three of them became a family. Not a conventional family, certainly. They lived in a penthouse with rotating security. Their dinner conversations included discussions of organizational restructuring and political influence, and their vacations required advanced security sweeps, but a family nonetheless. They developed routines and inside jokes. Marco would do homework at the dining table while Clara read and Luca worked through paperwork. All of them simply existing in each other's presence with the comfortable silence that comes from genuine intimacy. They celebrated Marco's 14th birthday with a small party that included a handful of his new school friends and several of Luca's associates trying desperately to act like normal adults rather than career criminals. They took a trip to Italy to see the Raldi ancestral village where Luca introduced his son to distant cousins and Clara charmed everyone with her terrible Italian and obvious love for both her men. But underneath all of it, the clock was ticking. Clara's good days became less frequent, her pain medication stronger, her energy more limited. She started physical therapy to maintain mobility, then stopped when it became clear that maintaining was no longer possible. The goal had shifted to managing decline. She had conversations with Marco about what she wanted him to remember about her. Recorded videos for future milestones she wouldn't be there to witness. Wrote letters for him to open on his 16th birthday, his graduation, his wedding. She did all of this with remarkable grace, treating her own death as a problem to be solved practically, ensuring that both Luca and Marco would be equipped to continue without her. Luca watched all of this with an anguish he could barely contain. He'd spent his adult life believing that power meant control, that if he was strong enough and smart enough and ruthless enough, he could shape outcomes to his will. But Clara's illness was teaching him the cruelest lesson. That some things couldn't be controlled, that love meant being vulnerable to loss. That the most important parts of life happened in the spaces where power was useless. He'd given up years with his son to keep him safe. And now he was being given a handful of months with the woman he'd never stopped loving, knowing that no amount of money or influence could buy them more time. It was breaking something fundamental in him, cracking the armor he'd spent decades building, forcing him to feel everything he'd learned to suppress. The end came more suddenly than anyone expected, though in retrospect the signs had been there for weeks. Clara had been unusually tired, sleeping more during the day, her appetite declining even further despite Luca's attempts to tempt her with her favorite foods. She'd brushed off concerns with her typical determination, insisting she was fine, that it was just a bad week, that she'd rally like she always did. But on a Tuesday morning in early November, she simply didn't wake up. Marco found her first, having come to ask if she wanted breakfast. And his shout brought Luca running from his home office where he'd been handling correspondence. Clara was breathing but completely unresponsive, her body present, but her consciousness gone somewhere unreachable. Luca's emergency physician, a doctor on permanent retainer who asked no questions about unusual injuries or suspicious circumstances, arrived within 15 minutes and conducted a quick assessment before calling for an ambulance. Her organs are shutting down, he explained quietly, while Marco sat frozen on the couch, processing what was happening. The disease has progressed faster than anyone anticipated. This is what they call end stage. Her body is failing systemically. We need to get her to the hospital immediately. But I need to tell you that her prognosis is extremely poor. You should prepare yourself for the possibility that she may never regain consciousness. The ride to the hospital was a blur of sirens and traffic and Marco's tears and Luca's complete inability to process what was happening. He'd known this was coming, had known it for over a year now. But somehow that knowledge did nothing to prepare him for the reality of Clara unconscious, being wheeled through emergency room doors, surrounded by doctors asking questions about her medical history and current medications. He provided information mechanically, his mind operating on autopilot while some deeper part of him simply refused to accept that this was actually happening, that Clara was slipping away. That all her strength and intelligence and fierce will to live weren't going to be enough to fight what was happening inside her body. They moved her to intensive care, a private room that Luca paid for immediately, where machines monitored every failing system, and nurses came in regularly to adjust medications and check vital signs. The neurologist who eventually appeared explained in careful, compassionate terms that Clara had slipped into a coma, likely triggered by the toxic buildup of proteins in her brain combined with multiple organ failures. Her body is shutting down, the doctor said, and Luca wanted to grab him to demand he do something to throw money at the problem until it was fixed. But the doctor's expression stopped him. The look of someone who delivered this news too many times, who knew that all the money in the world couldn't reverse what was happening. We're keeping her comfortable and managing her pain, but the damage is irreversible. I'm very sorry, Mr. Raldi. It's now a matter of time. Luca stood in the doorway of Clara's room, unable to make himself walk inside, staring at the woman he loved, surrounded by tubes and wires and machines, her face peaceful in a way that seemed obscene given what was happening to her body. Marco pushed past him, going directly to his mother's bedside and taking her hand with a teenage boy's desperate belief that holding on tightly enough could keep someone from leaving. Luca watched his son collapse against Clara's bed, shoulders shaking with silent sobs, and felt something inside himself crack wide open. All the careful control, all the practiced discipline, all the armor he'd worn for decades simply shattering in the face of this moment. The doctor appeared beside him, speaking quietly to avoid disturbing Marco. Mr. Raldi, I need to tell you something unusual. Even in coma, Clara appears to be experiencing some level of awareness. We've been monitoring her brain activity, and there are patterns that suggest she might be able to hear, might be processing what's happening around her, and there's something else. The doctor hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. The nurses have reported that her lips move occasionally, forming words we can't quite make out. It's not uncommon in end-stage coma, but in Clara's case, it seems consistent, like she's trying to communicate something specific. Luca felt his heart stop. What is she saying? The doctor shook his head slightly. We can't be certain, but the night nurse swore she heard a name. She believes Clara is saying Luca over and over, just your name. I can't verify that medically. Lip-reading someone in coma is hardly scientific, but I thought you should know. If she is aware on some level, she might be trying to reach you. The words hit Luca like a physical blow, stealing his breath, making the hallway tilt around him. Clara was dying, slipping away into the darkness. And even there, even at the very edge of everything, she was calling for him. He forced himself to move, to walk into the room, to approach the bed where his son clung to his mother's hand. And what was Clara to him now? His past, his present, the future he'd given up. All of those things and none of them. Something deeper and more fundamental than labels could capture. He stood on the other side of the bed, looking down at her face, and watched as her lips moved in a barely perceptible motion, forming shapes that could have been his name or could have been nothing. Just random movements of dying nerves. But he wanted to believe the nurse. Wanted to believe that somewhere in the darkness, Clara was aware enough to know he was there. The hours that followed had a strange suspended quality, like existing outside normal time. Marco stayed by his mother's side, talking to her about school and chess tournaments and funny things his friends had said, filling the silence with the sound of his voice as if his words could anchor her to the world. Luca sat in the chair on the other side of the bed, holding Clara's other hand, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm that he wasn't even aware of making. Nurses came and went, checking monitors, administering medications, speaking in hushed voices about vital signs and declining organ function. Luca's underboss called 3 times before Luca finally answered, told him to handle everything and cancel all meetings, that he didn't know when he'd be back, and didn't care. As night fell and the hospital settled into its quieter rhythm, Marco finally exhausted himself, falling asleep in the chair with his head resting on Clara's bed, still holding her hand. A nurse brought blankets and dimmed the lights. And Luca found himself alone with Clara in the semi-darkness. Watching her breathe with mechanical assistance. Watching her lips form those words he wanted so desperately to hear. And something broke in him completely. All the years of control, all the practiced hardness, all the careful distance he'd maintained between himself and the world simply collapsed. Tears came for the first time since his father's death, silent and unstoppable, running down his face as he held the hand of the woman who'd changed him. Who'd given him a son, who'd come back into his life knowing she was dying. Just to give them all a little more time together. He started talking to her, his voice low to avoid waking Marco, saying all the things he'd never quite managed to say while she was conscious. He told her about the 13 years he'd spent thinking about her. About the photograph of Marco he'd carried in his wallet. Even though looking at it was painful, about how becoming a father had terrified him, but also given him something he'd been missing without knowing it. He told her that she'd been right to leave, right to insist on raising Marco away from his world, that their son was extraordinary because of her choices and her love. He told her that having her back, even for this brief time, even knowing how it would end, had been worth everything, that she'd taught him how to be something other than what he'd built himself into. That she'd shown him it was possible to be strong without being cruel, powerful without being destructive. "I love you," he said finally. The words he'd never quite managed when they were together. Always holding something back, always protecting himself from the vulnerability those words created. "I've loved you since the day you walked into my restaurant with your recording device and your impossible questions. I loved you when you left. I loved you every day for 13 years. And I love you now, watching you slip away. And I don't know how to do this, Clara. I don't know how to let you go when I just got you back." Her lips moved again, and he leaned closer, trying to make out what shape they formed, wanting so desperately to believe she could hear him, that somewhere in the darkness she knew he was there. The night stretched on with agonizing slowness, marked only by the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the quiet footsteps of nurses checking on their dying patient. Luca stayed in his chair, holding Clara's hand, watching her face for any sign of awareness, any indication that she knew he was there. He found himself cataloging everything about this moment, trying to memorize it even as he desperately wished he could forget. The specific shade of her skin growing more translucent with each hour. The exact pattern of her breathing assisted by machines. The way her hair spread across the pillow. The feeling of her hand in his still warm but increasingly lifeless. He was saying goodbye in the only way he knew how. By bearing witness. By refusing to look away even when everything in him wanted to run from this unbearable intimacy with loss. Marco woke near dawn, disoriented and stiff from sleeping in an uncomfortable chair. He looked at his mother, then at his father, and something passed between them. A recognition of shared grief, of mutual understanding that they were both losing the person who'd been their anchor. "She's really not going to wake up, is she?" Marco asked, his voice rough with sleep and tears. Luca wanted to lie, to offer false hope the way adults sometimes did with children. But he'd learned from Clara that honesty, even painful honesty, was a form of respect. "No," he said quietly, "the doctors say her body is shutting down. We're here to make sure she's not alone. To say everything we need to say, even if we don't know whether she can hear us." Marco nodded, processing this with maturity that shouldn't have been required of a 14-year-old. He stood up, moving to the window where early morning light was starting to filter through the blinds. And when he turned back to face Luca, his expression was complicated. Grief and anger and something that looked almost like understanding. "Mom told me once that you let us go because you loved us too much to risk us. She said that was the hardest thing you ever did, letting her walk away when you wanted to chase after her. I didn't really get it then. It seemed like if you loved someone, you'd fight to keep them. But I think I understand now. You're doing it again, aren't you? Letting her go because holding on would be selfish." The insight staggered Luca. This recognition from his teenage son of the pattern that had defined his life. The constant calculation of when love meant releasing rather than grasping. When strength meant stepping back rather than fighting. "Your mother taught me that," Luca said, his voice cracking slightly. "That real love sometimes means putting someone else's needs before your own desires. I've failed at that more often than I've succeeded. But she kept teaching me, kept showing me what it looked like to be brave enough to do the right thing, even when it cost you everything." They spent the day taking turns at Clara's bedside. Father and son united in vigil, speaking to her separately and together, telling stories and sharing memories, filling the room with words as if language could somehow keep her tethered to the world. Luca found himself talking about things he'd never discussed with anyone. His father's death, the moment he decided to take over the family business, the years of building power brick by brick. He talked about meeting Clara, about their brief, intense relationship, about the night she told him she was pregnant, and he realized he had to choose between being selfish and being good. Marco talked about his childhood in Portland, about his mother's stories of his father, about how he'd imagined this dangerous stranger who'd given him his eyes, and his intensity, but nothing else. As afternoon faded toward evening, Clara's breathing became more labored, even with mechanical assistance. Her vital signs, which had been weakly stable all day, began deteriorating rapidly. The doctors came in to explain what was happening using clinical terms that couldn't disguise the basic truth. She was actively dying now. Her body's remaining systems shutting down one by one. They could increase pain medication to ensure she felt nothing. Could maintain her on life support indefinitely, but there was no reversing what was happening. Luca made the decision quickly. Keep her comfortable. Don't let her suffer. Let nature take its course. It was the last gift he could give her, ensuring that her death was as peaceful as possible, even if nothing else about the situation could be. Luca sat down on the bed beside her, careful not to disturb the various tubes and wires, and Marco took the chair, still holding his mother's hand. The three of them formed a triangle around the bed, the family they'd become over the past year, holding together as one part of that triangle prepared to dissolve. And in that moment, as twilight deepened outside the window and machines beeped their steady rhythm and Clara's breathing became increasingly shallow, Luca finally understood what she'd been trying to give them all this time. Not just a chance to know each other, though that had been part of it. Not just an opportunity to build a relationship before she was gone, though that mattered, too. What Clara had given them was permission to be more than what they'd been built to be. She'd taught Luca that a man who'd made himself into something hard and dangerous could still learn to be gentle, could still transform without losing his strength. She'd shown Marco that his father wasn't a monster or a saint, but a complicated man trying to be better than he'd been, worthy of understanding, even if not always approval. And she demonstrated for both of them that love didn't require perfection. That people could fail each other and hurt each other and make terrible choices and still be worthy of love. Still be capable of change. Still build something meaningful from broken pieces. The last hour was quiet. Just the three of them and the machines and the gathering darkness. Clara's breathing became more irregular. Longer pauses between each breath, her body slowly releasing its grip on life. Luca held her hand and Marco held the other, and they both told her they loved her over and over, wanting those to be the last words she heard if any part of her was still capable of hearing. And then, as the sun fully set and the room was illuminated only by the glow of medical equipment, Clara's lips moved one final time, forming a shape that could have been his name. Could have been nothing. But which Luca chose to believe was her last message to him. I'm here. I was always here. And even though I'm leaving, some part of us will remain. Her breathing stopped with no fanfare, no dramatic moment, just a cessation. One breath and then no next one. The machines immediately registering what had happened. Nurses appearing to confirm what everyone already knew. Clara Bennett was gone. Her body remaining, but the essential spark that had made her herself extinguished. Marco collapsed against the bed, his grief raw and uncontained, 14 years old and motherless, crying in the way that only children who've lost a parent can cry. And Luca, this man who'd spent decades believing that strength meant never breaking, found himself crying, too. His tears mixing with his son's, both of them shattered by this loss. But even in the midst of that grief, even as they said goodbye to the woman they'd both loved, something else was happening. Marco reached across his mother's body and took his father's hand. And Luca held on. And they stayed like that for a long time, connected by their shared loss, by the person who'd brought them together, by the impossible gift she'd given them even as she left. Clara had known she was dying when she walked back into Luca's life. She'd known that introducing Marco to his father was a gamble. That bringing herself into Luca's world was dangerous. That everything about this arrangement violated the careful boundaries she'd maintained for over a decade. But she'd done it anyway because she understood something that Luca was only now beginning to grasp. That the legacy we leave isn't found in the things we accomplish or the power we accumulate or even the good we manage to do during our time here. Our legacy lives in the people we change, the connections we forge, the love we manage to build even in impossible circumstances. Clara's legacy was this moment. Father and son holding hands across her body, united by grief, but also by something else, something stronger. She'd taken a man who'd believed he had to be alone to be strong and shown him that real strength comes from allowing yourself to be vulnerable. She'd taken a boy who'd been raised in safety and given him a father who was learning how to be more than his worst choices. The weeks that followed were brutal in their practical demands, funeral arrangements and legal paperwork and the mundane cruelty of paperwork that reduced a life to signatures and forms. Luca handled it all with mechanical efficiency while Marco stayed in the penthouse, going through his mother's things. Reading her letters, watching her videos. Processing his grief in the way teenagers do when the world shifts beneath their feet. They learn to be father and son without Clara as intermediary, stumbling through it, making mistakes, but somehow making it work because she'd given them enough foundation to build on. Luca kept his promise to become someone his son wouldn't have to lie about. He systematically dismantled the criminal aspects of his empire, taking a significant financial hit to transform his organization into something that operated entirely on the legal side of the line. It took years and required letting go of power he'd spent decades accumulating. But every time he considered backing out, he'd remember Clara's face in that hospital bed. Remember her lips forming his name. Remember the gift she'd given him by believing he could be more than what he'd made himself. Marco grew up splitting his time between finishing high school and learning his father's business. The legitimate version, the one that Luca was building to replace what he'd been. He went to college and studied business and came back to work alongside his father, bringing Clara's idealism and Luca's pragmatism together into something neither could have created alone. He was the proof that people could transcend their origins, that children didn't have to repeat their parents' mistakes, that love and intention could break cycles that seemed inevitable. And on the anniversary of Clara's death, every year, Luca and Marco would visit her grave and tell her stories about what they'd built, about the life they were living, about the ways they'd honored her memory by becoming the best versions of themselves they could manage. Luca would stand there and remember that last night in the hospital, remember her lips moving in what he chose to believe was his name. Remember the extraordinary gift of her return. Even as she was leaving forever, because Clara had been right about everything that mattered, she'd been right that their son deserved to grow up free from the violence of Luca's world. She'd been right that coming back, even while dying, could give them something irreplaceable. She'd been right that love doesn't require perfect circumstances or ideal conditions or even much time. It just requires the courage to show up, to be vulnerable, to believe that connection matters more than safety. And she'd been right that even in death, even in that final coma, even in those last moments when her body was shutting down and her mind was somewhere unreachable, love could still speak through lips that barely moved, could still reach across the darkness, could still whisper a name that meant everything. Luca here, always, forever. The months following Clara's death revealed truths about grief that Luca had never understood during all his years of causing it. He'd orchestrated deaths, ordered executions, been responsible for more loss than he could quantify. But he'd always been on the inflicting side of that equation, never the receiving end. Grief, he discovered, wasn't a single overwhelming emotion, but rather a constantly shifting landscape of smaller destructions. Moments when he'd reach for his phone to call Clara before remembering she was gone. Mornings when he'd make coffee for two out of habit. Nights when he'd wake up convinced he'd heard her voice only to find empty silence. It was the cruelty of muscle memory, the way his body kept expecting her presence even as his mind accepted her absence. Marco's grief manifested differently with the volatile unpredictability of adolescent emotion. Some days he'd be almost manic with activity, throwing himself into schoolwork and chess tournaments and learning everything he could about his father's business. Other days he wouldn't leave his room, couldn't be convinced to eat, would snap at Luca with anger that was really directed at a universe unfair enough to take mothers from 14-year-old boys. Luca, who'd spent his adult life commanding respect through controlled intimidation, found himself completely unprepared for the messy reality of parenting a grieving teenager. He couldn't fix this with money or influence or strategic planning. All he could do was be present, absorb Marco's anger without taking it personally, and provide the steady reliability that Clara had asked him to offer when she was gone. They learned to navigate their new reality through small rituals that honored Clara's memory while building their own relationship. Every Sunday morning, they'd cook breakfast together, an activity neither had much skill in, resulting in burned pancakes and experimental omelets that ranged from edible to disastrous. It was Marco who suggested it, remembering that his mother had always made Sunday breakfast special, and Luca had agreed immediately. Recognizing the value of traditions in creating stability, they'd sit at the kitchen island with their mediocre food and talk about the week ahead, about school and business and whatever was on Marco's mind. And slowly, painfully, they built something that resembled a normal father-son relationship. If you ignored the armed security outside and the fact that their conversations sometimes included discussions of organizational restructuring and legitimate business expansion, Luca kept his promise about transforming his operations, but the process proved far more complex and dangerous than he'd anticipated. You didn't simply walk away from decades of criminal enterprise. There were debts owed and favors expected. Alliances that depended on his participation in activities he no longer wanted to be part of. Rivals who saw his withdrawal as weakness and opportunity. He had to negotiate his exit carefully, maintaining enough of his reputation for ruthlessness that people didn't mistake his transformation for vulnerability while systematically divesting from operations that couldn't be legitimized. It required a delicate balance. Being dangerous enough that no one tested him while being honorable enough that people trusted his word when he said he was done with certain aspects of the business. His underboss, Vincent Calabrese, who'd been with him for 15 years, finally confronted him 6 months after Clara's death. They were in Luca's office, the legitimate one downtown, not the private facility where the actual decisions used to be made. And Vincent closed the door with the kind of deliberate care that signaled a serious conversation was coming. "Boss, I need to understand what's happening here. You've walked away from 3 major opportunities in the last month. You turned down the construction bid that would have given us control of the entire South Side. You refuse to participate in the union negotiation that every other family is involved in. People are starting to talk, saying that you've gone soft, that the woman changed you, that you're not the same Luca Raldi who built this organization. Luca looked at Vincent, this man who'd been loyal through wars and investigations and threats that would have broken most people, and made a decision about honesty. You're right. I'm not the same man. Clara did change me, and I'm not apologizing for that. But anyone who mistakes my transformation for weakness is welcome to test that theory and discover how wrong they are. He stood, walking to the window that overlooked the city he'd controlled for 2 decades. I'm building something different, Vincent. Something my son won't have to hide from or lie about. Something that doesn't require the kind of violence we used to accept as necessary. I understand if that's not the organization you want to be part of. I'll give you a generous exit package and references that will open doors anywhere in the country. But if you stay, you're staying for this version, not the old one. Vincent was quiet for a long moment, processing this ultimatum, weighing loyalty against the comfortable familiarity of the life they'd built together. Finally, he nodded slowly. I'm in. Not because I think you're right about all of this. I still think you're taking unnecessary risks, giving up power you might need later. But I'm in because you've never steered us wrong before, and because I saw what that woman did to you. She made you human again, boss. Maybe that's worth more than I understood. It was the first of many such conversations with associates choosing to either embrace the new direction or accept generous buyouts and recommendations to other organizations. Luca lost about 40% of his people in that first year. But the ones who stayed were the ones who understood that evolution wasn't weakness. It was survival of a different kind. The legitimate business empire he built was impressive in ways his criminal one never could be. He invested heavily in real estate development that included affordable housing and community benefits. Started a venture capital firm that focused on minority-owned businesses. Opened a foundation in Clara's name that provided college scholarships for students from disadvantaged backgrounds. He used every connection and every dollar of influence he'd accumulated through decades of operating outside the law to now work within it, and discovered that being known as someone who kept his word and treated people fairly opened doors that intimidation never could. It wasn't about redemption. Luca was too realistic to believe he could erase decades of choices that had hurt people. It was about transformation, about becoming someone his son could respect, about honoring Clara's belief that he was capable of being more than his worst decisions. Marco watched all of this with the sharp observation that came from being Clara's son. He'd inherited her journalist's instinct for seeing beneath surface narratives. On his 15th birthday, sitting in the penthouse after a small celebration with his school friends, he asked the question Luca had been waiting for. Do you regret it? The life you lived before, the things you did? Luca considered lying, offering some sanitized version that would make him more sympathetic. But Clara had taught him that teenagers deserved honesty. I regret some of it. The violence that was about ego instead of necessity. The times I chose intimidation when negotiation would have worked. The people who got hurt because I didn't care enough about collateral damage. But I don't regret building something from nothing. Or protecting people I cared about. Or surviving in a world that would have destroyed me if I'd been weaker. Life isn't morally simple, Marco. Good people do bad things. Bad people do good things. Your mother understood that better than anyone. She saw exactly who I was and loved me anyway. Not despite my flaws, but including them. That conversation marked a shift in their relationship from father managing son to something more like partnership. Marco started asking deeper questions about the business, about the transformation Luca was attempting, about how to balance pragmatism with principles. He'd inherited his mother's idealism, but was developing his father's strategic mind. And the combination made him uniquely suited to understand what Luca was building. They started working together more formally, with Marco spending summers and school breaks learning various aspects of the legitimate operations. Asking questions that challenged assumptions. Bringing fresh perspectives that helped Luca see opportunities he would have missed. But grief remained the third presence in their lives. the ghost that joined them for every meal and every conversation. They learned to talk about Clara naturally, sharing memories and inside jokes, keeping her present through stories rather than trying to move past her as if she'd never existed. Luca told Marco things he'd never told anyone, about their first meeting, about the intensity of their brief time together, about the letter she'd sent announcing Marco's birth and how he'd read it hundreds of times over the years. Marco shared his own stories of growing up with a single mother who'd been both parents, who'd been honest about his father existing but unavailable, who'd never spoken badly about Luca despite having every reason to be angry about his absence. 2 years after Clara's death, on what would have been her 45th birthday, Luca and Marco drove to the cemetery where she was buried. It had become their tradition, these visits that marked time passing without her. They brought flowers, yellow roses, which had been her favorite, and sat on the grass beside her headstone, which read simply, Clara Bennett, journalist, mother, teacher of better ways. It was Marco who'd chosen those words, capturing in 7 words what she'd been to all of them. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Marco spoke quietly. I think she knew, when she came back to Chicago, when she decided to bring me into your world, I think she knew exactly what she was doing. She was building us, making sure we'd have each other after she was gone. Mom was always about the long game, always thinking 3 steps ahead like you taught me to do. Her last investigation wasn't about corruption or politics. It was about making sure her family would survive without her. The insight was so profound, so exactly right that Luca felt tears sting his eyes for the first time in months. Clara had been playing the longest game of all. Not just introducing father and son, but weaving their lives together so completely that her absence, while devastating, wouldn't destroy the structure she'd built. She'd taught Luca how to be vulnerable enough to parent. Taught Marco how to understand complexity without losing his moral center. Taught both of them that love meant showing up even when circumstances were impossible. She was the smartest person I ever met, Luca said finally. Smarter than me, smarter than any of the strategists and lawyers and advisors I've worked with over the years. And she used all that intelligence in her last year to make sure we'd be okay. That's a gift I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of. As they drove back to the city, Marco asked another question that had clearly been building for a while. Do you think you'll ever? Would you want to find someone else date again? Luca was surprised by the question. Hadn't really considered it. Had been so focused on grief and transformation and building a relationship with his son that romance seemed like something from another lifetime. I don't know, he answered honestly. Your mother she was everything, Marco. I'm not sure I have it in me to open up to someone else like that, to be that vulnerable again. And besides, anyone I might be interested in would have to understand that you come first, that building our relationship is my priority, that I'm a package deal now. Marco was quiet for a moment, then said something that revealed how much he'd matured in 2 years. Mom wouldn't want you to be alone forever. She told me once when she knew she was getting sicker that she hoped you'd find someone eventually. She said you had too much love in you to keep it locked away. That part of her gift was teaching you how to feel again, and she'd hate to think that gift died with her. The conversation stayed with Luca, planted a seed that would take time to grow, but which marked the beginning of him considering that life after Clara might include more than just work and parenting. That someday, when enough time had passed, he might be capable of opening his heart again. The transformation of his organization continued steadily over the following years. By Marco's 17th birthday, the Raldi empire was almost entirely legitimate, a network of successful businesses that operated transparently, paid taxes fully, and contributed to the community openly. There were still whispers about where the money had originally come from, still people who remembered what Luca had been, but increasingly he was known as a businessman and philanthropist rather than a criminal. The Clara Bennett Foundation had become one of the most respected scholarship programs in the Midwest, sending dozens of students to college every year. The affordable housing developments his company built were models of how to do urban development responsibly. The businesses he'd invested in were creating jobs and opportunity in neighborhoods that had been written off by conventional investors. Marco graduated high school with honors and acceptances to multiple prestigious universities. The night before he was supposed to make his final decision about which school to attend, he came to Luca with a proposal that was vintage Clara in its careful thought and moral complexity. "I want to take a gap year, work with the foundation, learn the business from the ground up, spend time understanding what you've built before I go off to study business theory in a classroom. I know Mom wanted me to have a normal college experience, but I also think she'd understand that I need to know where I come from before I can decide where I'm going." Luca recognized the wisdom in this, recognized Clara's influence in Marco's ability to chart his own course while honoring both his parents' perspectives. They agreed on the gap year with the understanding that Marco would still go to college the following year, would still get the education Clara had valued so highly. That year, working together deepened their relationship in ways Luca hadn't anticipated. Marco brought fresh energy to the businesses, asked questions that challenged comfortable assumptions, connected with younger employees and community members in ways that Luca couldn't. He also brought his mother's gift for seeing the human element in business decisions, pushing back when Luca's proposals were too focused on profit and not enough on impact. They argued sometimes passionate debates about strategy and values that would have seemed impossible 3 years earlier when they'd been strangers connected only by biology. But they'd learned from Clara how to disagree with respect, how to value being challenged, how to make better decisions by incorporating perspectives different from their own. On the 3rd anniversary of Clara's death, Luca and Marco returned to the cemetery with their traditional yellow roses and found they weren't alone. A woman was standing near Clara's grave. Late 30s, professional attire, looking at the headstone with an expression of deep sadness. She turned when she heard them approach, clearly startled. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to intrude. I was Clara's editor at the newspaper before everything. I try to visit once a year to remember her and the impact she had." Luca and Marco introduced themselves and the woman's eyes widened with recognition. "You're Marco and you must be. Clara talked about you both near the end when she knew she was dying. She told me that her greatest accomplishment wasn't any article she'd written or story she'd broken. It was bringing the two of you together, teaching you how to be better than circumstances suggested you could be." The conversation that followed was emotional and illuminating. The editor, whose name was Patricia Rodriguez, shared stories about Clara's work, her dedication to truth, her compassion for the people she interviewed, her belief that journalism could actually change things if done with enough integrity. She told them about articles Clara had written but never published, investigations she'd started but abandoned when her illness progressed, dreams she'd had about exposing corruption and holding power accountable. "She was brilliant," Patricia said, tears sliding down her face. "One of the best journalists I ever worked with, and she gave it all up, her career, her ambitions, everything to spend her last year building a family instead of breaking stories. I didn't understand that choice at the time. I thought she was wasting her talent. That fear of death had made her abandon her principles. But now seeing you both understanding what she was building, I think maybe it was the most important work she ever did." After Patricia left, Luca and Marco sat by Clara's grave in silence, processing this new perspective on her choices. Finally, Marco spoke. "She really did see us as her masterpiece, didn't she? Like she could have spent that last year trying to make one more great article, win one more award, cement her legacy as a journalist. But instead she chose to invest everything she had left into making sure we'd become who we needed to be. That's a lot to live up to." Luca nodded, feeling the weight of that responsibility settling over both of them. They were Clara's legacy now. Her last and greatest project, her proof that people could change and families could heal and love could triumph over circumstances that should have made it impossible. As they drove back to the city, watching the sun set over the skyline that Luca had once dominated through fear and now influenced through legitimate power, Marco said something that captured everything they'd been building. "I think I finally understand what Mom was trying to teach us. It's not about being perfect or erasing the past or pretending we're something we're not. It's about being brave enough to evolve, to let love change us, to believe that who we're becoming matters more than who we've been. And as long as we keep doing that, as long as we keep trying to be the people she believed we could be, she's not really gone. She's in every decision we make, every person we help, every time we choose the harder right instead of the easier wrong. Luca reached over and squeezed his son's shoulder. This young man who'd somehow become wise beyond his years through grief and love, and Clara's carefully planned last gift to them both. Your mother would be so proud of you, Marco, of the man you're becoming. Of the way you honor her memory, not through sadness, but through action. She's proud of both of us, I think, for taking what she gave us and building something good from it. And as they drove through the city toward home, toward the life they'd constructed from loss and love, and the woman who'd believed they were capable of more than either had imagined, Luca understood finally what Clara had known all along. That her death wouldn't be the end of their story, but rather the beginning of something she'd carefully architected to outlive her. A legacy built not on what she'd accomplished, but on who she'd helped them become. A love so powerful that even death couldn't diminish it, only transform it into something eternal.